Some of the websites that promote LASIK eye surgery have a statement to the effect that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has approved LASIK as being safe and effective. That's a true statement. But what they leave out makes it a partially true statement that for you as the prospective patient actually becomes a deceptive half-truth that is seriously misleading. And when I see those statements, the FDA has approved this as being safe and effective without the rest of the story, which I'll get to in a minute, I'm always reminded of an experience I had. When I was an MBA student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business back in the mid-'80s, I did an independent study project on ethics in the tobacco industry, which I learned is an oxymoron. And one of the people I interviewed was a man named James Bowling, who at the time was senior vice president at the Philip Morris Cigarette Company. And he was telling me all the reasons why you couldn't trust the scientific studies showing that cigarette smoking caused various diseases. And he told me about the Framingham Heart Study, biggest study of heart disease ever conducted. And he said what they found at Framingham in this long-term longitudinal study is that moderate smokers, which he defined as about a pack a day, had an elevated risk of dying of a heart attack compared to non-smokers. But heavy smokers, which he said is 2 packs or more a day, their risk of dying of a heart attack was actually lower than non-smokers. And what's that tell you, he said? That you ought to smoke a lot to protect yourself from heart disease? And he went on to say, well, of course it tells you these scientists they're trying to make a case that can't be made, just picking and choosing their data. It turned out later when I checked with the Framingham Heart Study, everything James Bowling told me was true. It's what he didn't tell me that made it a lie. The reason heavy smokers had such a low rate of dying of a heart attack is so many of them died of lung cancer at a young age and didn't live long enough so that their hearts could give out on them. And it's sort of reminiscent, it's sort of a similar situation. If a LASIK surgeon tells you about the FDA having approved LASIK and doesn't tell you that the man who was responsible for getting LASIK approved at the FDA, Dr. Morris Waxler, is now leading a campaign to outlaw the procedure, which he says causes far more complications, far more injuries than the industry ever submitted. He says the industry has submitted false data, deceptive data. He's actually requesting a criminal investigation. And he says that currently, to this day, LASIK surgeons are covering up, not reporting, hiding, settling out of court bad outcomes so they don't have to report them, so that the success rate is maintained at a deceptively high level. If the doctor doesn't tell you the rest of the story, you're only getting a half-truth. And a physician with integrity, I think of someone as a real doctor who really cares about your health, your safety, your eyes, as opposed to a profit-maximizing business person who just happened to have a medical degree. A real doctor would want you to know that. A real doctor would say, you ought to read Dr. Waxler's petition. You ought to understand what he's saying. He could say, I don't necessarily agree with it, and you and I should have that conversation, and I'll tell you why. But for the surgeon to not tell you something that is that important really reflects a lack of integrity on that person's part. If they really cared about you being a fully informed patient, they would ask you to read that. If you have not read Dr. Waxler's petition, you are not a fully informed patient on the dangers and the risks of LASIK. No matter what sort of informed consent form you sign, you have not been given a fully informed consent if you haven't been told about and had explained to you what Dr. Waxler is saying. So before you let them cut on your eyes, make a point of reading Dr. Waxler's petition to the Food and Drug Administration. You also ought to go to the website. There's a website of people who are signing a petition to support Dr. Waxler, most of whom are LASIK victims. More than 500 people have signed that so far. And the most common theme among all those 500 signatures is LASIK ruined my life. And they talk about the profound dry eye disease. They talk about visual impairment, not being able to see as well. They talk about how their eyes hurt all the time. You really ought to understand all that before you submit to LASIK eye surgery. And if your surgeon hasn't told you about this stuff, you really got to ask, is he more interested in my wallet than my eyes? Does he have integrity? Does she have integrity? Because if they did, they would tell you about this stuff, and they would have an open, honest discussion with you instead of just giving you a sales pitch.